that growth is a good thing. We've actually arranged our economy so that it really only works as long as it is growing. So here's a picture of debt in the U.S. economy. Clearly, if GDP is going to grow, we have to have more debt. We have to have more money, which is debt. And that's been happening for decades. Both GDP and debt have been growing. Not just government debt, that's the slice at the top, but consumer debt, corporate debt, all the rest. Now, it's actually possible for debt to grow faster than GDP. And we've been doing that too, especially in the economies of the West, but in many, many countries around the world. Why do that? Why grow GDP? Why grow debt faster than GDP? Well, in order to push consumption forward so that we can consume more now and pay later. And everybody wants to consume more because we're constantly being talked into it by advertising. Well, in fact, there was a kind of turning point in the 1980s with regard to all of this. Because prior to the 1980s, GDP and debt were growing at pretty much the same rate. It was in the 1980s that they began to diverge. What happened in the 1980s? Well, globalization started. What does that have to do with it? Well, what was globalization about? It was very largely about offshoring or outsourcing labor. So American workers were beginning to compete with workers in other countries. At first, largely Mexico, but then eventually more so China and other countries in Asia. So this is pressing down wages for American workers. Prior to the 1980s, U.S. workers had seen incremental increases in wages, in real terms, when adjusted for inflation year after year. Starting in the 1980s, not so much so. Real wages of American workers basically peaked out around 1973 and haven't gone anywhere since then. So, if wages aren't increasing, but consumption has become 70% of the U.S. economy, and people want more stuff because we're constantly being advertised at, how do we make all of this work? Well, with more debt. And so this is the point at which debt starts to grow faster than GDP. Okay? So American households start going into more and more debt. Mortgage debt, credit card debt, and then this new debt. You see, if you take out a loan, for you that's an obligation to repay that loan. For the bank, that loan is an asset because they expect not only the repayment of the loan but also interest. So that asset can be bought and sold to other parties. So as American households are taking on more debt, for the financial industry, this is an explosion in assets, right? And so the financial industry is then able to leverage these assets even further. So mortgages get leveraged into mortgage-backed securities. And then derivatives, which are based on these assets, which are basically bets on what's going to happen to the price of assets. Actually, you can write derivative contracts on almost anything. It's sort of like a, it's a casino, if you will. So we have the assets themselves, we have collateralization, and then we have derivatives written on top. So the amount of debt spirals upward to astronomical dimensions. The financial industry is growing as a result of that. It's growing as a percentage of the economy, and therefore the power of the financial industry is growing. The financial industry begins to lobby Congress to change the financial rules so as to take off restrictions and regulations put in place after the Great Depression to keep the financial industry from over-leveraging these debt-based assets. So we get the repeal of the Glass-Steagall law, which had put a firewall between investment banking and commercial banking. So what's happening is Wall Street is becoming, as I said, more powerful, and it's changing the rules. At the same time, by lobbying Washington, it's also, in effect, corrupting the political process. In fact, what used to be corruption, buying and selling politicians and using Wall Street as a kind of giant casino, these things become perfectly legal. Right? We usually think of corruption as being a few bad actors breaking the rules. Well, the rules have been changed. So what might be thought of corruption is now just business as usual. Okay? So this leads to the creation of bubbles, financial bubbles, one after another. Of course, we have the dot-com or internet bubble of the late 1990s. But the biggest bubble of all was the housing bubble, the largest credit bubble, not just in U.S. history, but probably in world history. This is net new debt over the last 15, 17 years, starting 1995. As you can see, most of the new net debt for all of these years was in the mortgage sector. Huge pile of new debt in the 2000s. You can see the bubble very clearly. New government debt is a pretty small sector until we get to 2008. Suddenly, all the net new debt, after you subtract the stuff that's being paid off or defaulted upon, all of the new net debt is from the government. What's going on here? Well, what happened, of course, was that when the housing bubble burst, the real estate price bubble, American households lost approximately $6 trillion in net worth. So government steps in and tries to fill the void, tries to keep the economy together by borrowing and spending, the Keynesian stimulus strategy. And so government becomes the borrower and spender of last resort. And that's basically where we still are now. We have two philosophies that are out and about these days about how to solve the financial and economic crisis. One of them is Keynesian, which says that when we have an economic downturn like this, government has to step in and borrow and spend to flip us back into the growth mode. Right? Well, we've tried that for the past few years, and what we did was we bought ourselves a short and fairly anemic recovery at the cost of several $trillion in terms of not only stimulus packages, but bank bailouts and loan guarantees and so on. But then there are those who look at that and say, well, it hasn't worked, so what we need to do instead is cut back on government borrowing and spending. And if we do that, that will create room for private enterprise to step in, create jobs, and get the economy growing again. There's no evidence that that is going to happen. In fact, where we're seeing austerity programs applied, as in Greece, the economy is shrinking even faster. So what's going on here? Could it be that we've hit fundamental limits to growth? Well, we were warned all the way back in 1972. This is a book I read as a 21-year-old kid back in 1972. It changed my life. In fact, really all my adult life has been shaped by the information contained in this book. It was extraordinary. It was the first attempt to use computers to model the interaction between population growth, resource depletion, and environmental impacts from industrial accidents. what this team of scientists did was basically program a computer with all of this data. And of course, the software available at that time was very primitive. The computer itself was very primitive by today's standards, and the data were, quite preliminary. We have much more robust data, much better computers and software today. But for 1972, this was the state of the art. And no matter how they massaged the data and the software, they kept coming up with a peak and decline in world industrial output sometime in the first couple of decades of the 21st century. So they doubled the world's resources in their input data. They tried to model what would happen if governments created policies to rein in population growth and pollution. And they were able, doing these things, to push out the industrial collapse by a decade or two or three. But it still happened. Now, it's actually kind of intuitively obvious that something like this might be possible because, after all, if our industrial growth of the past few decades has been based largely on the cheap, concentrated energy of fossil fuels, well, we know that fossil fuels are finite. These things aren't going to last forever. So whether the base of this sine wave is broader or narrower, whether world reserves of oil and coal are 4 or 5 times what we currently think they are or less, from a big historic perspective, it kind of doesn't matter. It matters to us personally whether what the conditions of the remainder of our lives will be, but to historians 1,000 years from now, this is what the fossil fuel era is going to look like, one way or the other. So does that mean that civilization is going to follow the same trajectory? Well, maybe, I don't know. Is this something that we should worry about right now? Or is it going to take care of itself? Will we find alternative sources of energy that will enable us to just keep growing even as fossil fuels deplete? Well, as I studied these issues over the past several years, it's become pretty clear that this is an issue that we need to worry about right now. The U.S. is where this whole industrial paradigm really took off. When we talk about the automobile industry, as we were doing earlier, and the consumer credit industry and so on, advertising, the U.S. is where all these things happened, because the U.S. was fossil fuel ground zero for decades. This is where the oil industry started. During the early 20th century, we were not only the world's foremost oil-producing nation, we were the world's foremost oil-exporting nation. We were producing half the world's oil in any typical year. So it was disturbing to a number of observers to see when oil discoveries in the U.S. started declining after 1930. And then oil production in the U.S. started declining after 1970. We became the world's foremost oil importing nation. Now what's happening is we're seeing this same pattern in country after country around the world. Former oil exporters are becoming oil importers. And world oil discoveries have been declining since 1964. Now, we're not running out of oil in the sense that, 5 years from now there will be no oil left. No, we're still finding oil. But the thing is, we're finding oil in smaller pockets, generally speaking, and we're starting to count as oil stuff that is of such low quality that even though we've known it exists for decades, we never counted it before because we thought, well, why even bother with that stuff if we got light sweet crude? This is actual this is actual world crude oil production over the past few years. What's happened is, since about 2004, 2005, we've been on a plateau, a kind of bumpy plateau. Even though prices of oil have been generally increasing to record levels. And even though